Warm greetings to all the viewers that are joining us from across the world, but as usual, in particular, to those that are up particularly early in Latin America and the Caribbean, and those that are particularly late at an ungodly hour in order to join us in Far East Asia at this 10th, I believe it is, 10th episode of The Third Way Live with the SG. The space that we've sought to provide from the Executive Office in order to have genuine dialogue and exchange with every single one of you. That we may not only speak to you more directly about what it is that we do at the OSC, about the vision that is ours in terms of the collective construction of a third way of development, but most importantly, out of a recognition that if we are to achieve this third way of development from the Greater South, by the Greater South, yet for the entirety of humanity, then it is essential, it is critical that this endeavor not be spearheaded by the Secretariat of the OSC, but by every single one of us, every single one of you. And therefore, most importantly, this is a space, as most will be aware by now, for you to articulate your questions, your critiques, your proposals, which I will address within the limits of time, without filters. But of course, this 10th episode of The Third Way Live with the SG is perhaps more unusual than others. Because, as you may notice, I am not at my office, but here we are, in what will, starting from tomorrow, be considered the General Assembly Hall of the Organization of Southern Cooperation. Because this afternoon, here in Addis Ababa, we are a day before the opening of the second ordinary session of the General Assembly of the Organization of Southern Cooperation. And of course, even though this is a space that I will seek always to open up first and foremost, to hear from you directly, I cannot help myself in confirming, to a certain degree, my reputation as an interminable speaker. And therefore, what I would like to mention, because it is true that over the past 9 episodes of The Third Way Live with the SG, we've discussed a number of issues. We've discussed the OSC mandate. We've discussed the program proposal that we will be presenting at this upcoming General Assembly, that is what will direct our endeavors for the upcoming 2 years. We've spoken of the multidimensional nature of the third way of development from and by the Greater South. We've also discussed other issues such as communications, leadership, and of course there are many more issues to discuss. But it seems appropriate for me to focus today in my introduction, which I will make as brief as possible in order to have more time of dialogue and exchange with every single one of you, about the General Assembly itself. As you may be aware, the General Assembly of the organization is identified in our constitutive charter as one of the 3 main organs of the OSC. The General Assembly, that is, the Secretariat, which I have the honor to lead, and of course, most crucially, the financial subsidiary that will give sustainability to our organization and will give alternative sources of finance to our member states. But the General Assembly is more than just one of the 3 main organs of the OSC. It is the supreme decision-making, policy-making body of our collective. It meets every 2 years in its ordinary sessions. And of course, it is meeting next week, that is from tomorrow, Monday, all the way to Thursday, with another meeting related to the General Assembly happening on Friday. Because we are reaching a point as an organization where, yes, the program that had been adopted at the first General Assembly is coming to a conclusion. But most importantly, we are completing a certain phase of our existence. If I were to put it in general terms, I would conceive that the OSC has gone through multiple phases that have been completed one after the other. From 2020, at which our constitutive charter was adopted, to December 2021. We were speaking at the time of the ideational, preparatory phase of our organization as we were planning to build an organization from scratch. From December 2021 to June 2023, it was really the institutional operationalization phase. That is, when we were negotiating our headquarters agreement, when we were hiring from scratch a secretariat from across the world, and the span of few months went from a handful of dedicated individuals to the over 100 professionals that we are now. From June 2023 to January 2024. That was fundamentally our intramural consolidation phase, consolidating our secretariat, consolidating our capacities to deliver on the programs of the member states. And from January to date, we entered the most important of our phases, because the OSC was not created to exist in and of itself. We were not created in order to have a secretariat. We were not created in order to have a headquarters. The OSC was founded out of a deep-bedded conviction by our countries and our associate members who are from civil society and academia, that the time had come for a new kind of intergovernmental organization, capable of tangibly delivering, tangibly contributing to the development aspirations, the authentic development aspirations of our peoples and our countries. And therefore, the most important phase from January 2024 to date has been the phase of programmatic delivery, of concrete, tangible delivery. Through the 400 scholarship program that we launched, through the launch of the Greater South Information System that occurred in February this year, through the Greater South Learning Enrichment Resources Nexus, through the OSC Institute that has been reinforcing the capacities of our member states, and from which the experts of 16 countries having already graduated from that institute. But as this General Assembly is about to open, we enter, I believe, not only into a new programmatic cycle of 2 more years with new programs. That, of course, is part of it. But we enter a new, parallel phase as programmatic delivery continues. In that phase is the phase of extramural engagements, of engaging more proactively, not only with our member states, but engaging more proactively with non-member states, engaging more proactively with our universities, engaging more proactively with our student unions, engaging more proactively with other organizations in the endeavor that is ours of building a collective that goes beyond the OSC Secretariat, that goes beyond the programs that the OSC will be implementing, and that puts every single one of the actors of development within our societies within the driver's seat, as the protagonists, the shapers, the forgers of that future. And therefore this General Assembly that will open tomorrow is a crucial one, a critical one. I would dare say the most important meeting, and God knows that we have had countless meetings at the OSC, the single most important meeting to date of the Organization of Southern Cooperation. Because here tomorrow, in this hall, the high representatives of our member states, our founding states, the executive heads of our associate members, who are once again from civil society, who are once again from academic bodies, who are coordinating organizations of indigenous peoples, will converge in this room and engage in a democratic exercise to not only review everything that we have done and clap, but identify as well the shortcomings that have been ours, which are inevitable, because we are the club of the perpetually dissatisfied. And to proceed from there to the articulation together of the future of this organization, but most crucially, the avenues through which we can build the future that our peoples want and that humanity in its entirety deserves. But of course, some will say, and I see some faces expressing that concern, that is all very good and well, but that sounds very abstract. So allow me perhaps to unveil slightly the backstage of what the General Assembly is and how this General Assembly will operate. But allow me perhaps to say that the unique characteristic of the OSC General Assembly, because I spoke of a democratic exercise, and I do not use that word lightly. Our General Assembly is one of the very few governing bodies of intergovernmental organizations where it is genuinely all countries with one country, one vote. We do not have a smaller committee or executive board or council where fewer countries are seated, make the major decisions and then submit them to the General Assembly or the main governing body for ratification. No. At the OSC, in all our instances, it is all the countries together, deliberating and voting on all documentation. But of course, since this is the ordinary session and a new program needs to be approved, we are speaking of 4 days of intense deliberations. Tomorrow, we will be engaging on conversations on procedural matters, of course, that are inevitable, on institutional matters, chief amongst which is, of course, that tomorrow the Union of the Comoros will conclude its presidency of the General Assembly, and the member states will start the session by electing their new president. That will take, I do not know if you can see this on the camera, but will take the seat over here of the president. Of course, we will also be discussing substantive issues of a strategic nature. As you will recall, I had discussed the program that I plan to present to our member states. And therefore, tomorrow, two major items will be discussed. As part of the programmatic, the common program proposal that we are making. The first is that of intensifying South-South cooperation and integration by approving the operational framework of the framework to reinforce exchanges between youth and regions through education, FREIRE, the student and academic mobility scheme across our three continents of the OSC. We will also be discussing, crucially, the manner in which to get the Secretariat to be closer to the member states through the opening of regional offices so that we are able to better support our countries and our peoples. We will, of course, also be discussing one crucial axis, which is solidifying the organization that the South deserves, to make it even more responsive to the aspirations of our peoples. The next day, the more substantive issues emerge, because the next day is the segment of education, research, and culture. A segment at which we are proposing, in terms of our programmatic activity, three main axes of action: building knowledge-powered societies, accelerating the balanced and inclusive transformation of education, and revitalizing cultural and artistic yields. The following day still is the segment for technology and digitalization, where we will be discussing, deliberating with our ministries of technology and other representatives of the member states, the manner in which we can achieve over the next 2 years of becoming drivers rather than remaining passengers of the technological revolution. And finally, we will have the development finance segment. The development finance segment where the purpose, the objective, the endeavor emerges out of pure lucidity of the member states. That is, we can speak of building knowledge-powered societies. We can speak of becoming drivers of the technological revolution. We can speak of accelerating the balanced and inclusive transformation of education and revitalizing cultural and artistic yields. But if we do not give ourselves the means and the resources to invest in those critical sectors of our development, then our endeavors will remain nothing more than aspirations. Testimonial at best. And therefore, the development finance segment of the General Assembly, concluding these 4 days' deliberations, will be the opportunities for our countries to discuss how to best address the external debt burden that removes the fiscal space necessary for our countries to invest in their development, but also to discuss alternative sources of highly concessional finance in order to materialize what has been until today elusive aspirations. And chief amongst this, of course, is the discussion around the OSC's financial subsidiary. If you will, the OSC's own multilateral development bank, which we are proposing but the General Assembly shall decide to name as the Greater South Development Bank. But the financial subsidiary has this aspect that is unique, and hence why I started by saying that the General Assembly is democratic. I will go further. The OSC in its entirety is based upon the democratic principle of one country, one vote, regardless of your economic capacity, regardless of your land mass, regardless of your population size. Because once the constitutive bylaws of the financial subsidiary are adopted, we will have collectively seen the birth of the first multilateral development bank whose shares are 100% owned by the organization, which means that the supreme instance of governance of the financial subsidiary of the bank will be the General Assembly. Whereas in other institutions, it follows the private sector model. The country that brought in the most money, has the most shares, has the most votes. And therefore, that is usually creditor countries that take the major decisions. And so 4 days of intense deliberations, from which we will emerge with a new program, which once again, to summarize, has 7 axes: building knowledge-powered societies, becoming drivers of the technological revolution, accelerating the balanced and inclusive transformation of education, revitalizing cultural and artistic yields, creating shared and green prosperity, intensifying South-South cooperation and overall integration, and solidifying, to cement it all, solidifying the organization the South deserves. But most crucially, aside from documents and budgets and programs to be adopted, this General Assembly's value is what it provides beyond decisions. This moment of encounter, of communion amongst countries, individuals, organizations that, yes, are from very diverse regions, very diverse contexts, but that are united in this common vision for a third way of development, of which you must be the protagonists. And hence why I promised I was going to be brief. I have failed. I would like to open the floor to all of you in order to ask your questions, express your critiques, articulate your proposals, which I will address, again, without filters. And of course, those questions can be about the General Assembly or about any other aspect of this collective endeavor. So I will wait for them to give me the computer in which I will see all your comments and questions. Thank you. Saleh from Germany. Okay. So, I will read a question from Saleh from Germany, who mentions, building on this, I'd like to pose a follow-up question that ties into my personal experience here in Germany. Often I'm asked whether I align with the left or the right, and I find it challenging to respond because my epistemology, experiences, and socialization don't fit neatly into these categories. For me, such labels feel limiting and don't fully capture the nuance of how I see the world or engage with issues. if you were in my position, navigating a space where such binary categorizations are prevalent, how would you approach answering this question in a way that is honest, reflective, and avoids potential backlash or the risk of being labeled or cancelled, particularly in the social media era? How can we foster conversations that allow for more fluid and intersectional understandings of identity and ideology? Saleh, you have asked me to dissert on something that would deserve multiple volumes of books. And the truth is, it is very difficult for me to answer because I do not know enough of your context. So it is not advice that I am giving you because I am not qualified to give you personal advice. However, what I can say with regards to this binary of left or right is at the level of the Organization of Southern Cooperation, but beyond, at the layer of building a third way of development. We must have the capacity to understand that today, as peoples, as countries, as organizations, and even as individuals, faced by existential threats of climate change, soil erosion, in an era in which our social contracts appear to be ever more tenuous, it is crucial for us to understand that we may disagree on absolutely everything. I assure you, Annabelle. But that at the end of the day, the challenges that we face, the existential threats that lie ahead, all of these, my dear Saleh, all of these can only, for better or for worse, be resolved, be overcome through our collective action and by working together to do so. And in this regard, and I've said this in the past, that the third way of development not being a third model is neither left-wing or right-wing. It can be left-wing, depending on national priorities. It can be right-wing, so long as we agree on a certain set of principles, such as endogenous development. That being said, I would go a step further now. And the step further is to say that the common characteristic that unites us all is being the club of the perpetually dissatisfied. Allow me to give you a very concrete example to explain how you can perhaps, I do not know, engage with those questions that are being asked to you, whether you're left-wing or right-wing. Perhaps the answer is, I am dissatisfied with the status quo. And in this endeavor, if you look at the status quo of the world, a left-wing person will, of course, quite obviously, in the era of the neoliberal supremacy, be dissatisfied with the status quo, which is highly capitalistic. But on the other end of the spectrum, a Schumpeterian capitalist will be equally dissatisfied that is a capitalist, that believes in Schumpeter's definition of the genius of capitalism, that is this capacity of creative destruction, that is, we destroy entire sectors. The entrepreneur destroys entire sectors, but creates new sectors that generate development. Because I see a few confused looks. I assure you that when the first entrepreneur came up with the idea of a car, they completely destroyed the entire industry of carousel and coach building and horse training. But they created entire new sectors that opened up job opportunities and allowed society to move forward. And why do I say that a Schumpeterian capitalist, for instance, would be an equal member of the club of the dissatisfied in the face of the status quo? Because today we have entered into a highly dangerous phase, which is hyper-financial capitalism, where the majority of transactions today are not creating services, are not creating goods. The majority of transactions that we see today happen on the stock market, where my advisor, Dr. Getahun, may own a certain number of shares in a company, not creating anything with those shares, and waiting for the market to go up and sell me those shares. And I will purchase those shares, and our friend, Dr. Getahun, will have made money out of nothing. He will not have created anything. And I, in turn, will hold on those shares, wait until the market grows, the market capitalization of the company, of the shares, increases, and I will sell it to Pearl at a profit. And yet, I will not have created anything. There is no creative destruction. And therefore, to go back to the issue of left-wing, right-wing, perhaps the common punto de partida, point from which we can start the conversation, is are we or are we not dissatisfied with the current status quo? Regardless of what your critique is of that status quo. And I do believe that we must have a more complex understanding of policies. It is true, it is not just left-wing, right-wing. For instance, regardless of whether you are left-wing or right-wing, we need to have a conversation in the era of climate change about degrowth. But degrowth in and of itself is insufficient. There are certain sectors that must grow within our economies. And there are other sectors on which we need to impose a degrowth strategy. But then the way we go about it, whether through left-wing policies or right-wing policies, is another debate, one that might be necessary. In fact, I would argue it is necessary to have that debate, just not today. Now is not the time to bicker about those issues. Now is the time, Saleh, for us to collectively engage in an endeavor that is fundamentally the endeavor of dismantling the systems that have led the world to the point of dismantling itself, and work together to articulate that alternative that emerges from a diversity of models. The last thing I would say to you, and this is why I'm finding it very difficult to give you a clear-cut answer on how you should deal with it, is I also believe that all policies are contextual. The policies that can work in a certain country at a given moment are not necessarily policies that you can make universal and have work equally well. And this is what is so very challenging, but also so very beautiful about politics in the original etymological sense. Managing the city affairs, the issues of the city, that is, managing our community. It is that it's profoundly human, because it requires every single person to engage constantly in an analysis and interpretation of their reality. There are no recipes, only construction. So I hope I've more or less answered your question. If I have not, do not hesitate to challenge me or ask a follow-up question. I see another question from Anonymous that says, "Dear Secretary General, I would like to say congratulations on all your milestones and wish you a successful General Assembly. Please let us know the progress regarding the scholarships. When will be the announcing date of the results, and what outcomes do you expect from this General Assembly?" Well, there are two questions there. Regarding the scholarship program, as you're aware, we signed earlier this year an agreement with the International Cooperation Group of Brazilian universities. And the result of that agreement was ensuring up to 400 postgraduate scholarships for citizens of our countries from across our countries in renowned universities in Brazil. And of course, this was the first year. And I'm very glad to actually inform you that the results have been published, at least the provisional ones, with over 310, I believe, acceptance from the applications that came from our member states, and very well divided across 17 countries. And of course, I see that Mary is here from the Department of Research, Evaluation and Foresight. Has communication already been sent to the individuals?
No, not yet. You're writing to us and you're responding. So Miguel has been actively responding to those emails. So we've had over 30 emails since Friday of the announcements. So we're responding as they send the notifications.
Okay.
Announcements.
Very well, very well. So we're currently responding, but I assume that the universities will also send the acceptance letters by the end of the month?
Before the end of the month,
Yes. So before the end of the month, you should receive, hopefully, an acceptance letter, or you will receive an invitation to apply again next year. And this is with regards to the scholarships. Now, regarding the outcomes of the General Assembly, I think more or less, I have mentioned this earlier. That being said, perhaps let me summarize again what I mentioned about the outcomes of this General Assembly. The number one most important outcome of this General Assembly would be the adoption of the common program for 2025-2026, where we will have generated as a collective of countries, of organizations, and individuals the necessary momentum to accelerate the pace towards this third way of development, to accelerate the pace in our endeavors when it comes to research, when it comes to education, when it comes to technology, when it comes to finance, when it comes to culture and the arts. And that is mostly the main outcome that we are expecting. But if you have a more precise question, I will be very happy to answer it. I see one last question, and then perhaps we will be concluding, because I know we are all running in order to finalize the preparations of tomorrow's session of the General Assembly. But perhaps let me address this one, which says, "Hello, dear Secretary General, we wanted to know more details about GRESFET." Well, GRESFET is the greatest South Fair for endogenous technologies, which in fact will occur right after the General Assembly on the 2nd and 3rd of December for its first edition here in Addis Ababa at the Science Museum, co-organized this year for this edition by the Ministry of Innovation and Technology of Ethiopia. And GRESFET seeks to address, in this same dynamic of becoming drivers of the technological revolution, seeks to address a multi-pronged issue that face our countries. The first is the lack of visibility of our startups, our technology companies within the South. The second is the limited nature of strategic partnerships that are South-South for technological development. And the third is the scarcity of spaces for our young entrepreneurs, for our startups, for our technology company to exchange knowledge, practices, in order to strengthen their endeavors after technological development. And therefore, in this regard, GRESFET provides this common space that convenes every 2 years, inviting startups, entrepreneurs, tech companies from across our countries to meet for 2 days with booths that are allocated to them to showcase their startups, their technological innovation, their digital solutions, to give them the visibility that is necessary. Provide a space as well for strategic partnerships to be elaborated, identified between the governments of our countries, but also crucially, between some of our startups and larger companies across the South, so that they may have economies of scale. And finally, through panel discussions, interventions, work groups, breakout sessions, provide to those startups the opportunity to have an exchange of best practices, of ideas, of experiences, both in terms of challenges that must be overcome and successes that must be replicated. And I am very pleased to know that, at least the last time I have checked the figures, but this keeps being updated. There had already been the allocation of booths to more than 40, I believe, startups from 14 of our countries. Whilst at the same time I know that over 39 or something of the sort geniuses, that is what I'll call them, because I don't understand what they do. But I know it's very important. So that is the best definition of a genius I can come up with. Have already enrolled to the hackathon that was launched as part of GRESFET. And I think we have over 10 major panelists coming as well to speak and engage over those 2 days with our entrepreneurs, with our startups, that GRESFET may act as a catalyst for endogenous homegrown technology development. But that being said, what is more interesting is less for me to explain to you what GRESFET is. The website can do that very well. What is perhaps more interesting is to say, and then what? 2 days and we go home. Not at all. In addition to the value of this happening, even if it was a one-off, the plan is then as well to support our member states to create national versions of GRESFET that can be tied then through a network that can then, in the next edition of GRESFET, ensure in 2 years' time a greater involvement of our startups, a greater pool of experience to be shared, and most crucially, with the necessary technical support following the end of GRESFET to ensure the success of our endeavors. I hope I've answered your question. I see one last question, which I will address, is from Abraham Berhanu, who says, how can OSC members enhance cooperation in the face of growing geopolitical tensions and economic challenges, especially between the global south and developed nations? This is a crucial question. And I think that part of the OSC endeavor, it is true, we are in a world of growing geopolitical tensions. There is no denying this. But the OSC, being this space of encounter amongst countries that are culturally diverse, that are diverse in their daily realities, in their historical trajectories, but also ideologically very diverse. The OSC is not anti-North, nor is it anti-BRICS. The OSC constitutes in itself this third position where the main point is the focus on development, on concrete, tangible projects that contribute to our country's development, regardless of our ideological differences. And I think that the way that we can enhance that cooperation amongst our members in the face of growing geopolitical tensions is to ensure that the OSC embodies that new multilateralism that I have repeatedly mentioned, characterized by equality amongst parties, equity in their relations, and solidarity that is practiced horizontally rather than charity that is practiced vertically, but also engaging in an understanding that this new multilateralism, finding its true essence in the South-South cooperation that the OSC embodies, must remain, and that is our determination, engaged in what I call the 3 Ds. It must remain democratic, that is, one country, one vote. Again, regardless of economic capacity, regardless of land mass, regardless of population size. It must remain diverse, recognizing that our success, our collective success, emerges not on us ensuring that we are all on the same ideological page or imposing a model that everybody ought to follow, but that our universality, the universality of the success of our endeavor, is found in the respectful encounter of our differences. And finally, it must remain development-centered, not engaged in the petty, futile, abstract, intellectualistic debates and bickering, but centered on tangible results that contribute to the aspirations of our peoples and the authentic development for which we at the OSC, and of course, when I say the OSC, I don't only mean the Secretariat, but our member states, our associate members, the authentic development for which we are unwavering, indefatigable. I hope this more or less answers your question, and unless there is a major objection, I propose that we move to conclude, not because I am not enthralled and enthused by this exchange, but because we have many engagements the day prior to the opening of a General Assembly, and most importantly, I am sure that many of the team members who have respectfully, out of respect, joined this session would much rather be finishing the other work that they ought to do before tomorrow than to continue listening to me ad nauseum. That being said, as we conclude and as we move towards this General Assembly, that will be the single most important assembly meeting to date, remember the words of Mario Benedetti. Y hay quienes se desmueren y hay quienes se desviven. Y así entre todos logran lo que era un imposible, que todo el mundo sepa que el sur también existe. And there are those who die and those who live doing their utmost in this endeavor. And this way, between them, amongst all of them, amongst all of us, they achieve what was once believed to be impossible, that the entirety of the world may know that the South also exists.